Unique pattern deviation. A unique pattern deviation is going to send the flow and the information to intermediate events of different classes of processes. So here we have an example where we launch this process of a class of process B, and we deviate flow to this destination process. It's a process of the class of process A. Now the flow continues, and this unique pattern deviation must deviate the flow back to the class of process B. This is something we already know how to do, and we can do this with a unique deviation. We don't need a unique pattern deviation. But in this scenario, we want the class of process A to be able to deviate, in some cases, to events of the class of process B, or to events of the class of process C, or many other classes of process. So let's say class of process C is triggered and it deviates the flow to the class of process A. So when the flow reaches this system task here, we want to deviate the flow back, but this time we want it to deviate flow back to a totally different class of process. So here we do need a unique pattern deviation. And why do we need a pattern? Basically, because in order to deviate to different intermediate events of totally different classes of process, these EMs must be identical. They must have the exact same data structure, because it's impossible for me to map the fields from the class of process A to the class of process B, and also to the class of process C. And this is an example with only 3 different classes of process. But let's imagine I have 20 or 30 different classes of process, and I want class of process A to be able to communicate with all of those. So let's say I trigger class of process B. I work with information in class of process A. In this instance, I finish. I want the flow to be sent back. And the same thing happens with class of process C. But then let's imagine I also have class of process D, E, F, and so on. Okay, so we need this deviator in class of process A. We need it to be able to deviate to a pattern. And instead of mapping the fields with a specific process, we're going to map the fields with a pattern. Once we deviate the flow to that pattern, then the destination process is going to be able to receive that information, because the configuration of these intermediate events are set up as pattern intermediate events. We're going to see that in a moment. So first of all, how do we create a pattern? We have to go to structure. We have to go to processes. Once we're there, we're going to go into environment. And once we go to environment, we're going to see that there's several tabs. We're going to click on a tab that's called patterns. And once we're here, we're going to click on create a message event pattern. When we click create, we can give it a name. We add different fields. And this is our pattern. Once our pattern is created, we want to assign or attach that pattern to different intermediate events of different classes of process. So here I have an intermediate event where this pattern has been assigned. Okay, I have to go to this option that's called patterns and assign it. Once it's assigned, I can configure the deviator system task to deviate to that pattern. Okay, so in this case, we can see that the pattern that's been assigned to the class of process B and C are exactly the same. They're identical. So when class of process A needs to deviate the flow back to those processes, it's not going to have any problem. Here we can see how this system task is configured. Basically, the first thing we're going to do is select unique pattern deviation. The second thing we're going to do is select the pattern, the one that we previously created in structure. So it says for direct deviation to be available, we can just select it here. But if we want to use a web service, we're going to have to publish our pattern as a web service. Then here we can indicate the destination process where it's going to be saved in, the source process where it's going to be saved in, and we can map the fields. Basically, this is the same as all the other deviators that we've been seeing, but in this case, the information that's being mapped is from one pattern to the other one. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to go to structure and I'm going to create a pattern. So I go to environment, patterns, I create a new pattern, I call it audits, I save, and I add a few fields here. For example, I'm going to add fields A, B, and C. Okay, my pattern has been created. I'll save and exit. Now, the next thing I should do is assign this pattern to an intermediate event. But let's see what happens if I try to configure a system task and I don't have this pattern assigned anywhere. So let's go to this Deviator system task. I'm going to delete its configuration and I'm going to reconfigure it. So I click here on Deviator, function without web service. I select unique, and over here I have to select the pattern. It allows me to select the pattern. Here I can select where I want to where the destination process is stored. But here, if I go to origin process, it's giving me trouble. And this is because I haven't used this pattern anywhere. So I'm going to delete this information. Okay, and the first thing I want to do is configure a pattern. So I'm going to open a class of process. Could be this one. Okay, this one has an intermediate event. So I want to add a pattern here. I'm going to delete the information. And I'm going to configure it so it can be triggered via pattern. It offers me, obviously, the pattern. So I can select it. And now I can save and exit. Now I'm already using this pattern. What happens when I'm using a pattern? If I go to structure, I go to environment, I go to patterns, and I open this pattern, now I can't delete it because right now it's in use. If I want to see where it's being used, I'll have to click here. So this is avoiding me from making mistakes. Now, I go back to the system task and I want to reconfigure it. So I click on it, I select notifier, deviator, and I select without web service, and I hit continue. Now I select unique pattern, I select the pattern, I select the field where the destination process has been stored with the reference, and now here I want to map the origin process. I want to store it in the field that I have in the pattern. So here it's going to offer me all the fields that I have in the pattern, for example here. So now the reference of this process, once it's deviated, it's going to store the reference in this field in the destination process panel. And now, how do I know that this field has been added to the destination process panel? Because as soon as, well, let me save this first. I'm going to save this. So as soon as I go to this class of process and I add a pattern here, all the fields that were in the pattern are automatically added to the panel of this process. So here we can see that these three fields have just been added because I selected a pattern. So as soon as I select a pattern, all the fields that we had in that pattern are going to be automatically added to the panel of this process. Now, we said the reference of this process is going to be stored in this field of the destination process. Down here, we can map more fields. For example, we could say I want to map this one and this one. Here, we could actually map them with different fields from this process. But the destination, they're always going to be the fields that I have in the pattern. Obviously, this doesn't make sense, but I'm just showing you guys how it would be configured. So we're saying this one line text field in this process here is going to populate the field B that's in the pattern, wherever it has to deviate to. Then here I can select a return code, and that's it. I've got my system task configured.